street signs didn't point to any familiar places, and my GPS showed nothing but a blank screen. The unsettling whispers from unseen townsfolk grew louder as the sun dipped below the horizon. Rule 1, a voice hissed behind me. Never walk after dark. Voice, and a scream pierced the air. The engine sputtered, and my car rolled to a stop on the desolate road, headlights slicing through the growing mist. For a moment, the world was eerily silent, as though holding its breath, squinting at the road ahead, hoping for any sign of civilization. That's when I saw it. A crooked wooden sign half swallowed by the shadows of the looming forest. Welcome to Elder's Hollow. My stomach nodded. I didn't remember this town on the map. Behind me, the empty highway had dissolved into nothingness, leaving me stranded. My GPS, useless, blinked a hollow, searching in blockery. As I drove cautiously into the town, the houses appeared like ghosts, dark, sagging structures that seemed to lean in, watching me. A single streetlight flickered above, casting uneasy halos on the cracked pavement. The stillness was oppressive, broken only by the low creak of a distant swaying in the windless night. Then, something moved. A figure darted behind a house, faster than any person should be able to. My breath hitched, my hands clenching the steering wheel. And there it was again, closer this time, just beyond the edge of my vision. The growing sense of dread clawed at me. I was not alone. The sharp knock on my car window made me jump so violently I hit my head on the roof. Outside stood a man with hollow eyes and a face carved by years of dread. He gestured urgently for me to lower the window, his breath fogging the glass. "You need to listen," he rasped, thrusting a laminated card into my trembling hands. His fingers lingered, too long, cold and clammy, before retreating. "These rules. Memorize them. Follow them, or you won't survive the night." I glanced down. The list was bizarre. Absurd, even. 1. Never walk outside after dark. 2. Always smile at the lamplighter. Each line seemed more ridiculous than the last, yet something in his voice froze any protest in my throat. "What is this?" I asked, my voice shaking. The man's eyes darted to the darkening street. "Not here. Get inside. Now." Behind him, shadows writhed in the periphery, their movements unnatural, predatory. My car felt like the only safe place, but the man's panic was contagious. I grabbed my bag and bolted toward the nearest building, the sound of his hurried footsteps close behind. "If you hear the bell," he warned, breathless, "don't look." Behind us, a deep, resonant chime filled the air. The clock struck midnight just as my courage faltered. The inn was suffocatingly quiet, each tick of the clock echoing louder than the last. Despite the man's warning, curiosity burned in my chest. His voice whispered in my memory, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there. I pulled back the curtain just an inch. The street below was bathed in pale moonlight, the air unnaturally still, and then I saw it. A figure moved jerkily under the flickering street lamp, its body twisting and contorting as though its bones were liquid. It wasn't walking, it was dragging itself forward, limbs bending wrong. A scream lodged in my throat as its head snapped up, fixing hollow, black pits where its eyes should have been, directly on me. I stumbled back, the curtain slipping shut, but the sound came next. A scratching at the window, slow and deliberate, like nails raking against the glass. "Let me in," a voice rasped, chillingly familiar. It was my own voice. Heart pounding, I scrambled for something, anything, to barricade the window, but the voice grew louder, mocking, overlapping with other whispers until it became a maddening chorus. I realized then, I had broken the first rule, and it knew. The whispers didn't stop. Even as dawn bled a gray light into the room, they lingered, curling around my ears like cold breath. I barely slept, each creak of the floorboards or groan of the old building making my ear part leap, by something deeper than exhaustion. "You broke the rule," he said quietly. "They know you now." "I saw something," I stammered. "Last night. It wasn't human." Arthur's lips thinned. He gestured for me to follow, leading me to an abandoned church at the edge of The town. Walls were etched with strange symbols. "This is where it started," Arthur said, his voice hollow. "Our ancestors made a deal with something they didn't understand. It promised safety in exchange for obedience. The rules are all we have to keep it contained." I traced one of the symbols on the wall, my fingertips tingling like static. "What happens if we don't?" Arthur's eyes darkened. "They don't just take you. They twist you into one of them." A shadow moved behind him, too fast to be human. Neither of us turned. Arthur's warning sat heavy in my chest as I left the church. The daylight felt thinner, weaker, as if it barely held the night at bay. Shadows lingered in the corners of the buildings, moving in ways that defied logic. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I needed answers. Something tangible. Something that made sense. My legs carried me to the library's decrepit building tucked behind the town square. Inside, the air was musty, the shelves warped from decades of neglect. Yet, as I sifted through faded records and brittle papers, a chilling pattern emerged. There were names, hundreds of them, written in precise, looping handwriting. Beside each name was a date, often followed by a single word: vanished. The dates stretched back centuries, and the most recent one made my stomach drop. Elizabeth Walker, December 3rd. Today's date. A floorboard creaked behind me, and I froze. The hairs on my neck rose as the temperature in the room plummeted. "Elizabeth Walker," it whispered, its voice echoing like it came from deep water. My own name. I ran, the whisper following me into the daylight. But even outside, the cold stayed. The whisper didn't stop after I fled the library. It followed me into the streets, slithering through the air, like a cold breath on the back of my neck. I stumbled, gasping for air, only to see the townsfolk staring. From their windows, their expressions blank and unblinking. They knew. As I hurried toward the inn, I felt it, something tugging at the edges of my vision. I ignored it, but the pull grew stronger, a prickling, inescapable sensation. Against my better judgment, I glanced over my shoulder. There it was again. The figure, impossibly tall, its limbs bending at grotesque angles, was gliding toward me. I bolted for the door, wrenching it open and slamming it shut behind me. The lock clicked, but I knew it wouldn't halt. Inside, the room felt wrong, colder, darker. My reflection in the mirror caught my attention, and I froze. It wasn't me. The eyes staring back were black pits, the mouth twisted in a smirk that didn't belong. I scrambled to cover the mirror with a sheet, but the reflection didn't move. It watched, lips curling wider. As it mouthed, "You've broken too many rules." A sound came from the door, 3 slow knocks. My breath hitched as the knob began to turn. The knob twisted slowly, deliberate and steady. My back pressed against the far wall as I clutched the closest thing I could find. Nothing stepped inside, nothing visible. But the room darkened, shadows stretching unnaturally across the floor toward me. My chest tightened as a low, guttural whisper began to fill the space. Unintelligible but maddening. "I have to get out." I bolted through the inn's back entrance, the whisper trailing me like a noose tightening with each step. The town, bathed in eerie moonlight, seemed to shift and stretch as I ran, the streets folding in on me, shoving themselves like a labyrinth. Finally, I saw my car. Relief surged through me as I fumbled with the keys, hands trembling so violently I nearly dropped them. The engine sputtered, then roared to life. I hit the gas, the tires screeching against the cracked pavement. But the road didn't lead out. No matter how fast I drove, the town surrounded me, its structures looming higher, pressing in. The streetlights flickered, then died altogether, plunging me into suffocating darkness. A figure appeared in the headlights. My reflection, twisted and wrong, smiling as it whispered, "You can't leave." The car skidded to a stop as the figure in the headlights stepped closer, its movements jerky and unnatural. My hands gripped the wheel so hard my knuckles ached, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. It was me, or some grotesque mimicry. Its hollow eyes glimmered with malice, its smile splitting its face, then became bigger still as the reptilian lizard tightened its claws and slipped from its grip, far wider than should be possible. You broke the rules, it said in a voice that echoed my own, distorted and wrong. Now you belong to us. The car's interior lights flickered, then died completely. Shadows poured in through the windows, writhing like living things. The door locks clicked open on their own, and a cold, invisible force began to drag me out, I screamed, clawing at the seatbelt. But the shadows had hands that pulled, scratched, and gripped with inhuman strength. I was thrown to the ground. The town surrounded me now, its houses looming impossibly tall, their windows glowing with sickly yellow light. Shadows slithered from every direction, merging into one massive, shifting mass. Townsfolk. I saw Arthur, his eyes hollow and pleading, his mouth moving without sound. You can't win, the mass hissed, its voices overlapping in a cacophony. Submit. Desperation overtook me. I grabbed a rusted lamplighter's pole lying nearby and swung wildly at the spiel. Shadows. For a brief, fleeting moment they recoiled, their screeches filling the air. But as they surged back, I realized the truth. There was no escape. The pole fell from my hands as the shadows enveloped me, cold and crushing, their voices piercing my ears like shards of glass. My vision blurred, the world spinning into a vortex of black and gray. I screamed, but the sound felt distant, swallowed by the cacophony of voices, chanting, mocking, pulling me under. Then, silence. I opened my eyes to find myself standing in the middle of the town square. The oppressive darkness was gone, replaced by an eerie stillness. The houses stood as they had before, their windows dark and empty. The shadowed figures, the twisted faces, they had vanished. But something was wrong. The air was heavier, thicker, like it clung to my skin. I glanced down and froze. My hands, no longer my own, were translucent, veins coursing with something black and alive. Panic surged, and I staggered toward the nearest window, desperate for confirmation. The reflection staring back wasn't me. Its face was hollow, its eyes two endless voids. The same grotesque smile stretched across its face, the smile I'd seen in the headlights. A door creaked open behind me, and I turned to see the townsfolk filing into the square. They stood, silently, their eyes empty, their expressions blank. Arthur stepped forward, his face twisted with sorrow. You're one of us now, he said, his voice hollow. No, I whispered, backing away. This isn't real. But deep down I knew the truth. I felt it in the cold hollowness that had replaced my heartbeat. The rules weren't just a way to keep them out. They were a test, a leash, and I had broken it. As the bells chimed midnight, I joined them, my whispers joining theirs in the night. Outsider, waiting for someone to break the rules. They say stories are doors, and every time a story is read, the door cracks open a little wider. So now I ask, are you alone as you read this? Or is something watching from the shadows, waiting for you to break your own rules? If you dare, share this story. But remember, every retelling brings it closer to reality. How many rules have you already broken? The air smelled of mildew and old paper as I flipped through the book's yellowed pages. Scribbled in red, ink on the first page, were 5 ominous words. Do not read this aloud. I laughed nervously, thinking it was some gimmick to spook readers. But I didn't just read it aloud. I laughed while doing it. Now, the laughter isn't mine. It's everywhere, echoing from the walls, following me into the dark. The first sign that something was wrong came as I was reading the book. The words on the page seemed to ripple, shifting slightly as though they were alive. I blinked hard, rubbing my eyes. But when I looked, again the letters were normal, though their meanings still felt unsettling, like they carried a weight beyond language. Then the room grew cold, not the usual chill of an old apartment, but a biting, unnatural cold that sank into my bones. For me, I shook off the unease, laughing nervously. This is ridiculous, I said aloud, trying to shake the creeping fear. But the moment the words left my mouth, the lights flickered. A low, distant hum filled the air. Barely, audible, but impossible to ignore. Someone, or something, to be standing there. The hum grew louder, closer, morphing into what sounded like laughter. But it wasn't normal laughter. It was deep, guttural, and wrong, like it was coming from a throat that hadn't laughed in centuries. I slammed the book shut, my heart pounding. The laughter stopped immediately, plunging the room into an oppressive silence. But just as I let out a shaky breath, a whisper broke through the quiet, chilling and unmistakable. You shouldn't have read it. The book shifted slightly on the desk, almost as if it were breathing. My instincts screamed to run, but my feet wouldn't move. Something had changed, and I could feel it, like the air itself was watching me. And I knew, deep down, that whatever I'd let in wasn't leaving anytime soon. The whisper echoed in my ears, each word carving itself into my mind. You shouldn't have read it. Hands shook as I reached for the book, as if touching it might somehow make it stop. But the moment my fingers brushed the cracked leather cover, a sharp, icy jolt shot up my arm. I yanked my hand back, gasping. The laughter returned, faint at first, like it was coming from the walls. Then it grew louder, overlapping, and distorted, like a crowd mocking me from just out of sight. I stood frozen, every instinct screaming to run, but my legs refused to move. The book began to open on its own. The pages flipped furiously, faster than any breeze could manage, until it landed on the same page I'd read earlier. The words seemed to pulse, dark ink oozing across the page. Then came the voice, low, guttural, and impossibly close. You broke the rule. My chest tightened. This isn't real, I stammered, backing away. The lights flickered violently, plunging the room into strobing chaos. Shadows on the walls stretched and writhed like living things, their forms too twisted to be human. One of them detached itself, stepping into the room. Its body was indistinct, shifting like smoke, but its eyes burned red in the darkness. Ah! You called me, it said, its voice dripping with malice. And now, you are mine. The laughter swelled, filling every corner of the room, and my vision blurred. I stumbled backward, my foot catching on the corner of the rug, and fell hard onto the floor. The book landed beside me, its pages glowing faintly. The last thing I saw before the lights went out was my shadow. It wasn't moving with me anymore. It was moving toward me. The darkness was alive. I could feel it pressing against my skin, slithering into the room like it had. Wait, a presence I couldn't escape. The laughter faded, leaving behind a silence so profound it rang in my ears. Then I saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the room, its outline barely discernible against the thick shadows. It didn't move, but its form was wrong, distorted and angular, like it had been assembled by someone who didn't understand how bodies were supposed to work. Who are you? Its head tilted unnaturally to the side, and the sound of cracking bone filled the room. It took a step forward, and though its feet didn't touch the ground, each movement sent vibrations through the floor. You read the words, it said, its voice a low, guttural hiss that reverberated in my chest. And now, you've let me in. I stumbled back, tripping over the edge of the rug, my knees hitting the floor hard. My pulse thundered in my ears, drowning out my own gasping breaths. The figure moved closer, the room growing colder with every inch it advanced. Stay away, I croaked, trying to crawl backward. My palms scraped against the floorboards, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from its shifting, smoky form. Its face, or what should have been its face, came into focus. Two empty voids, where eyes should have been, a mouth stretching far too wide, filled with teeth that gleamed in the faint light. I will always be here now, it whispered. You are mine to haunt. A shadow reached out, its shape jagged and unnatural, and the lights flickered violently. Just as the darkness swallowed the room, I realized with chilling clarity, it wasn't leaving. It was staying, with me, forever. By morning, my apartment felt tainted, like the air itself was heavy with its presence. Every corner seemed darker, every shadow deeper. I hadn't slept. How could I? The thing had stayed with me all night, and whispering my name from places I couldn't see. I needed help. I grabbed the book, its weight colder than I remembered, and fled, cutting into my lungs with every breath. People bustled past on the street, oblivious to the terror clinging to me like a second skin. The bookstore was my only hope. The woman there had seemed to know more than she let on. When I stumbled inside, the bell above the door gave a hollow jingle that seemed to echo far too long. She looked up, her face pale, her expression grim. "I told you not to open it," she said, her voice low. "It's following me," I choked out, slamming the book onto the counter. "What is it? How do I stop it?" Her hands hovered over the book, but she didn't touch it. "It's not just a book," she said. "It's a key. You read the words, and now you've let something through." My heart hammered. Let what through? She glanced at the door behind me, her face drained of color. "It's here," she whispered. The door creaked open on its own, and cold air swept into the shop. A shadow spilled inside, stretching naturally across the floor. "Run," she said, but I couldn't move. Behind me, a voice purred, closer than ever. "You can't escape. Not now." Her final words were a dagger. You never should have read it aloud. The shop's temperature plummeted as the shadow spilled across the floor, coiling like smoke. The shopkeeper's whispered "run" echoed in my ears, but my legs refused to obey. It was here, filling the square footage, and I saw it clearly. Room with its presence, a weight heavier than anything I'd ever felt. The shadow rose, stretching upward until it towered over me. Its edges flickered like fire, but its core was darker than anything my mind could comprehend. And then, from the void, it spoke. "You called me. Now face me." Its voice was a symphony of whispers and growls, like 1,000 voices layered on top of each other. My breath hitched as it leaned closer, its void-like face inches from mine. The air felt electric, my skin prickling with static. The shopkeeper muttered something under her breath, a string of words that sounded ancient. I grabbed a small vial from beneath the counter and hurled it at the shadow. The vial shattered, and a silver mist erupted, slicing through the entity like a blade. It recoiled, its form writhing and shrinking. "You have to fight it," she yelled, her voice trembling. "The book is the key. Close it and bind it." I scrambled for the book on the counter, my fingers trembling as I flipped through its pages. The words echoed faintly, pulsing with a malevolent energy. The shadow surged forward, slamming into me like a tidal wave. Its voice filled my mind, cold and venomous. "You cannot undo this. I am part of you now." With every ounce of strength, I screamed the words written on the final page. "Umbras radiate." The shadow screamed, a sound that shook the walls, and then silence. But I could feel it, still lingering, watching. Some doors, once opened, never truly close. The silence that followed the shadow's scream was more suffocating than the noise itself. The shop was. Still, unnervingly so. My body trembled as I lay on the floor, the book clutched tightly to my chest. The faint glow of its sigil had dimmed, but the air around it pulsed faintly, like a dying heartbeat. I stopped it," I whispered, the words tasting hollow on my tongue. But the shopkeeper didn't look relieved. She stood frozen, her eyes wide with terror, as she stared at something over my shoulder. Slowly, too slowly, I turned. The walls were bleeding shadows, thin tendrils stretching and coiling like fingers, filling the room again. The entity was reforming, its pieces converging into something larger, darker. "You thought you could bind me?" It hissed, its voice louder now, rattling my bones. "You are the key, and I will always find you." I backed away, my breath hitching. The shopkeeper screamed, her body yanked backward into the growing mass of blackness. Her voice cut off abruptly, leaving only the sound of my panicked gasps and the creature's guttural laughter. The book burned in my hands, the sigil glowing fiercely. Words appeared on the cover, jagged and dripping. "The story is not over." The shadows surged toward me, and as they enveloped my vision, a single, chilling whisper echoed in the void. "I am inside you now." The world snapped back into focus, and I found myself alone. The shadows were gone, the air still, but the silence wasn't comforting, it was oppressive, as if holding its breath. The book lay closed in my hands, its sigil now dark, I staggered to my feet, my breaths ragged, my mind racing. I stumbled out of the shop, the sunlight almost blinding, and for a moment, I thought I had escaped. People moved around me, normal life carrying on as though nothing had happened. But then I saw her, the shopkeeper, standing across the street. Her body was stiff, her eyes empty, staring directly at me. My heart seized as I turned to flee, only to stop short. A man sat on a nearby bench, his expression vacant, his lips moving soundlessly, at an unnatural angle. Everywhere I looked, their faces turned to me. Empty eyes, hollow mouths, silent yet screaming. The laughter started again, faint and echoing, but this time, it came from inside me. I clutched my chest as the book burned against my skin, the sigil glowing faintly once more. In the ruined tower, reflection of a storefront window, I saw my own face twist into that same empty smile. "You are mine now," the voice whispered. "They say reading these words gives it power. Sharing them makes it stronger. You checked behind you just now, didn't you? What if it's waiting somewhere you haven't looked?" The invitation arrived in the form of a handwritten note slipped under my door. "You are invited to the funeral of Mr. Gerald Danton. Attendance is mandatory. Follow the rules exactly. Failure to comply will have consequences." The rules were neatly listed beneath the message, each more unsettling than the last. As I read them, the air seemed to thicken around me. One thing was clear. This funeral wasn't going to be normal. The envelope wasn't there when I came home that evening, but when I turned back from locking the door, it sat on the floor, pale, aged, and addressed to me in a spidery script I didn't recognize. My stomach twisted. I lived alone, and no one had knocked. I picked it up gingerly. The paper felt wrong, as if it had been soaked in something and left to dry. The edges curled slightly, as if recoiling from my touch. I tore it open, the faint smell of mildew wafting out. Inside was a single sheet of paper, its handwriting meticulously neat, but unsettlingly uneven. "You are invited to the funeral of Mr. Gerald Danton," it read. The message was stark and direct, and at the bottom was a line that made my blood run cold. "Attendance is mandatory." Below the message, a list of rules filled the page. Each was written in the same careful hand. 1. Arrive precisely at 7 p.m. 2. Bring a black candle. 3. Do not speak unless spoken to. 4. Do not leave your seat. 5. Do not look at the casket. My hands trembled as I read the final note. "Failure to comply will have consequences." A faint whisper echoed in the room, like wind brushing past my ear. I whipped around, but no one was there. The envelope slid from my hand, the paper inside seeming heavier as it hit the floor. The rules etched themselves into my mind, growing louder with each beat of my heart. Gerald had always been strange, but this felt alive, like something sinister, pulsing beneath the words. The funeral was tomorrow, and even as dread consumed me, I knew I couldn't refuse. Stage 7. The air outside Gerald Danton's house was suffocating, thick with a strange, sour smell that made my stomach churn. The sky above was an unsettling shade of gray, a color too dull to be natural, yet too dark to be early evening. I checked my watch. 6:59 p.m. The rules played on a loop in my head as I hesitated on the creaking porch. Arrive precisely at 7. Bring a black candle. Do not speak. My fingers tightened around the candle I had bought earlier. Its wax somehow colder than the evening air. The door opened without warning, the creak long and drawn out as if the house itself were groaning. A tall man in a black suit stood in the doorway. His face was pale, gaunt, his sunken eyes scanning me like a predator sizing up its prey. "You're on time," he said, stepping aside to let me in. His voice was hollow, a sound that felt more like a vibration in my chest than something I heard. Inside, the room was dimly lit by flickering candles lining the walls. Rows of mismatched chairs faced an ornate casket on a raised platform. The other attendees sat silently, their faces pale, their expressions blank. "Sit," the man said, pointing to an empty chair. I obeyed, my pulse racing as I avoided looking at the casket. The heavy air pressed down on me, each breath a struggle. Then, from somewhere unseen, a low, droning chant began, reverberating through the room. It wasn't in any language I recognized, and each word sent a shiver down my spine. The lid of the casket shifted slightly. My throat tightened. I couldn't look. I mustn't look. But something inside me whispered. The chanting grew louder, vibrating in my chest, though I still couldn't tell where it came from. My pulse pounded in my ears as I stared straight ahead, doing everything I could to avoid looking at the casket. The weight of the rules pressed against my mind, but curiosity clawed at the edges. Then the air shifted. A wet, dragging sound cut through the chanting, low and deliberate, as though something was moving inside the casket. Don't look, I reminded myself, gripping the cold wax of my candle so tightly it bent under the pressure. But the sound persisted, growing louder, closer. My head turned before I could stop it. My eyes landed on the casket. Its lid cracked open, just a few inches. A shadow moved inside, slow and serpentine, and then it stopped. I was looking. The chanting stopped abruptly, leaving the room deathly silent. Every head turned toward me, their faces blank, their eyes empty. "You were warned," he said, his voice echoing unnaturally. The lid of the casket slammed open, and a hand, gnarled and gray, gripped the edge. Its fingers twitched, the bones cracking as it began to pull itself upright. The air turned frigid, the light from my candle flickering violently. I tore my gaze away, but it was too late. The thing inside the casket was moving, and its hollow, gaping eyes locked onto me. "You broke the rules," the man growled. "Now it's coming for you." The thing let out a low, guttural laugh, and I knew there was no undoing this. The room felt like it had lost all air, the silence crushing. Every face was turned toward me, but I couldn't look away from the casket. Jerky, like a puppet pulled by invisible strings. A hand emerged first, skeletal and gray, the skin tight over jagged bones. Its nails were long and sharp. Its claws were silver, with a golden white point running through the white plastic, clicking against the wood as it dragged itself further upright. The head came next. No, not a head. A hollow skull covered in patches of decayed skin, its jaw hanging loose. Its eyes, or the voids where eyes should have been, locked onto me. The darkness within them wasn't just empty. It was alive, swirling and pulsating like it was hungry. I clutched the candle harder, the cold wax slick against my sweating palms. My legs trembled as it pulled, pulled itself out of the casket entirely, standing impossibly tall, its limbs too long and its movements wrong, like it wasn't used to having a body. Then it smiled. Its mouth stretched unnaturally wide, the corners splitting as black, tar-like liquid dripped from its lips. "You looked," it said, the voice reverberating through the room, scratching at my mind. "Now you're mind." The man at the front stepped aside, bowing to the creature as if it were royalty. "Your replacement is ready," he said. Replacement? My heart sank as the thing began to move toward me, its steps slow and deliberate. I stumbled back, but the chairs behind me were filled with silent, unmoving attendees, who stared ahead as if nothing was happening. It reached for me with those jagged fingers, its grin widening further. "The rules were simple," it hissed, "but you couldn't follow them." The creature's hand reached for me, its jagged nails catching the dim candlelight as it moved closer. My muscles locked in terror, the air in my lungs freezing solid. The rows of silent attendees sat like statues, their eyes fixed forward, ignoring the horror unfolding before them. My survival instinct finally kicked in. I lunged out of the chair, knocking it over with a deafening crash. The thing's fingers missed me by inches, scraping against the floorboards with a shrill, splintering sound. The man at the front barked a single, thunderous word. "Stop." The room erupted. Shadows on the walls stretched and twisted, detaching themselves like living things. They slithered toward me, cold and sticky as they brushed against my skin. The doors were gone, only walls where exits had been moments ago. I bolted toward the window, but the air felt thicker with each step, like I was wading through tar. Behind me, The creature let out a guttural roar that rattled the windows. "You can't leave," the man shouted, his voice booming. The shadows coiled around my legs, dragging me down. I grabbed a chair, using it to claw my way forward, raining onto the floor. Cold night air rushed in, clearing the suffocating fog in my head. I hauled myself through the jagged opening, ignoring the sting of broken glass on my arms. As I hit the ground outside, the house groaned behind me, the walls seeming to close in on themselves. The thing's distorted face appeared in the broken window, its grin impossibly wide. "This isn't over," it hissed. The shadows recoiled as I ran into the night, but its laughter followed me, faint but unrelenting. I didn't stop running until I was back inside my apartment. My chest heaved as I locked the door, bolted. I it and dragged a chair against it for good measure. Every shadow in the room felt alive, watching. The thing's laughter still echoed faintly in my ears, as if it had sunk into my bones. My arm stung where the glass had cut me, thin rivulets of blood snaking down to my fingers. I grabbed a towel and pressed it to the wounds, my hands trembling. Each second stretched painfully long, the silence, amplifying every creak and groan of the old building. I glanced at the clock. 3:17 a.m. Time felt meaningless. The escape, the running, it was already slipping into a foggy blur. But my relief was short-lived. A faint, wet thud echoed behind me. I froze. Something shifted, just out of sight. A faint silhouette moving where nothing should be. "No," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "You can't be here." The mirror's surface darkened, a shadow bleeding outward until it consumed the reflection entirely. My own face vanished, replaced by hollow, empty eyes and a grin too wide for any human mouth. "This isn't over," it said, the words scraping through my mind like claws. I stumbled back, the towel slipping from my hand. The shadow in the mirror reached forward, and, for one horrific second, I felt the icy brush of its fingers against my skin. Then it was gone, but the mirror remained black. I turned every light in the apartment on, but nothing could banish the sense of something lurking, waiting, out of sight. If you dare, share this story. But remember, the rules are not just fiction. Every retelling brings, nevertheless, to this story, some inspiration, the real you closer to the casket. Are you sure you're alone as you finish this story, or has it already started tapping at your window?